Well, we may wonder, how can there be a metaphysics of storytelling? After all, metaphysics is about describing the world as it is, the stuff of the world, the material of the world. And there are many kinds of metaphysics. So when we speak about storytelling, we would normally consider it maybe a form of epistemology. That is, how do we know the world? How do we describe the world? In other words, the world is out there, the people, the events, the underlying forces of nature and history, and our stories are chosen to communicate what's happening out there. But that's not quite right. Storytelling is not really part of communication studies. Storytelling is about world building. It is about creating a world within the imagination that touches the heart and therefore transforms a life. J.R.R. Tolkien spoke about this when he spoke about the world being God's creation, and each of us as a storyteller is a sub-creator. In other words, we help fill out the cosmos, the world. So what I want to suggest is that storytelling does just that. You don't learn storytelling, you don't use storytelling because it's more effective as a means of communication than lecturing or other things, but you use storytelling because you're creating a world. You're creating a world that you are rooted in subjectively and that you want to invite other people to enter into. It's not that you want to convert them, to tell them this is the world as it really is, it's my world. No, you want in your telling to invite the listener to understand you as another subject. You understand them as a subject, I-thou relationship. They're not objects. And your storytelling is a way of revealing who you are as a subject in such a way that the listener can understand you, the teller, and better understand themselves as well. So this metaphysics of storytelling sounds awfully philosophical, but I really feel there's no other way of approaching it because it's really a much more serious issue than merely effective communication, as all the contemporary media people, psychologists, and so forth pitch it to be. Now, the structure of the world as it really is of course, a challenge to us. And actually, the world is so rich that when we are engaged in this process of storytelling or subcreation, we have many, many options on how to fashion the world that we are creating, expressing. And I want to suggest that there are three primary ways of doing it, and that almost any story chooses one of these ways, but also can be reshaped and retold from the other two perspectives. So there's an incredible richness in storytelling based on its metaphysics, because it's not a question of spinning the story, it's a question of focusing and carving and shaping the story so that it expresses one of the primeval experiences of reality in the teller, in the listener, in the world of the mind's eye and the imagination. So let me just go over the three of them very briefly, and I'll explore them more deeply in subsequent lessons. The first one is really the easiest to enter into, and it's why it's perhaps the most popular. Almost everybody who's involved in storytelling has heard about the journey of the hero, the description that Joseph Campbell gives to what he calls the monomyth. He says all stories are really the one story. It's a story of someone who crosses a threshold, sets out on a journey, receives aid on the way, hindrance on the way as well, reaches the goal, successfully brings back, with the help or the hindrance of others, the gift that he or she has found in this journey, crosses the threshold, and brings it back into the everyday world. This is the stuff of epics. These are the great stories of humankind. All cultures have them, and Joseph Campbell has rightly identified them. And over the years, he has become very popular. Bill Moyers, with his series on public broadcasting, his interviews with Campbell have really emphasized this. And we tend to focus everything through this single filter of the journey. I'm going to just call it the journey. The monomyth is perhaps more accurate, but the journey is, I think, more evocative. But there are two other ways of looking at stories. And again, I'm going to come back to this in subsequent reflections so we can look at how a single story can be created, shaped, shared in any of these categories. Sometimes one category seems much more relevant, much clearer, but usually the other two categories will be as effective, but will reshape the story. It will change the impact of the story on the listener. And of course, it depends on the personality of the teller. It depends on who the audience is, what the time in history is, many, many, many other factors that all go into this decision. And what I want to suggest now is that the teller always, any teller, formal storyteller, or someone chit-chatting over a cup of coffee, is making a decision to use one of these three categories, because these are the basic metaphysical categories of narrative, of storytelling, of mythology, of anecdotes, of legends, of folk tales, of jokes, of all kinds of verbal creations. So if Campbell is the first, then there is a second. The second is an anthropologist who lived in the same era as Campbell, the 20th century, and his name is Claude Lévi-Strauss, a French anthropologist. Studied many of the texts of the great mythologies of the world, did field work in the, I think it was the jungles of the Amazon, but also maybe other places in Brazil, and wrote a whole series of books which had great impact on anthropology and mythology. His books are not easy to read, Joseph Campbell's are, and though his ideas are just as clear and eloquent and elegant as Joseph Campbell's, he hasn't had the same exposure. And what his essential approach is that a story or a mythology, a collection of larger stories, let's say a whole set of stories for a culture, is rooted in dichotomies of either or constantly. And probably, this is not his thought, but I mean, I think it's probably because we're bilateral, right? You know, we've got two hands, two arms, two eyes, probably two brains, a left brain and a right brain. And we tend to spin our tales, we tend to create the world in terms of these oppositions. And the oppositions are, and I'm going to recite some of them, but they're not always in that order. In other words, the first one isn't aligned with the first one. For example, light and darkness, evil and good, female and male, rich and poor, brave and cowardly, hopeful and despairing. On and on. This can just, mythologies are full of characters and events that express these oppositions. And Lévi-Strauss felt that the attempt of using language in this way, which is, I'm going to call it conflict. So we have journey stories, and now we have conflict stories. That the conflict stories are told in order to find a resolution, a meeting point between the conflicts. It's some sort of a transformation that gets us to a place that integrates the two. And of course, that's very temporary in his view. it's an improvisation that works only in the interaction, because we always fall back on our ordinary dichotomies. There will always be day and night. There will always be summer and winter. There'll always be the sky above and the earth below. But in our process of storytelling, we're trying to integrate the opposites. And this goes to the level of human experience. So in a society, this is what we're struggling to do politically. As I speak, we live in a time of great conflict between the left and the right in America and globally in Western societies. And finding the process to integrate the two halves is dangerous, it's frustrating, and yet we continue to look for it. The third one. So we've got two, and now we have three. The third one is another European, also from the 20th century, a man who specialized in the history of religions. And his name, he's a Romanian, and his name is Mircea Eliade. And Mircea Eliade took another approach. His approach was to look at stories, watch stories, listen to stories, and to deal with them in a certain way. Mircea Eliade, historian of religion, writer of very important works, for example, on shamanism and on yoga. Eliade believed that all stories were an attempt to create out of chaos. In other words, stories are always around the theme of chaotic situations, including the cosmic chaos, and the process of creating a world from the chaos. So we would normally think of this as, well, this is a specific kind of story, and it's a specific kind of mythology. Those are the creation myths. So, for example, the book of Genesis in Scripture is a creation myth. Native American peoples have creation myths, but it's only one kind of story. But that is not true. Because what Eliade understood was that we do face chaos all the time. Our lives are constantly falling apart. Our civilizations are constantly threatening, ripping apart at the seams. Our extended families, our work environments, all have these stresses, and at times they just seem to be falling apart and tumbling into some chaotic destruction. And so his suggestion is that our narrative process, a storytelling process, especially as told through storytelling, is a process of creating meaning, creating a world, creating, and overcoming the chaotic forces that leave everything in turmoil. So we've got three different kinds of aspects to this metaphysics of storytelling. One is the journey that Joseph Campbell speaks about. Secondly is the conflict that Claude Lévi-Strauss speaks about. And the third is about the creation that Mircea Eliade speaks about. I'm going to end now, and I'm going to explore each of these in sequence in my next videos. I'm Bob Wilhelm. I'm a storyteller.